Everyone, welcome to our webinar about artificial intelligence in education. My name's Jamie Hunt. I'm Head of Education at the Health and Care Professions Council, and I'll be taking you through this session today. Just a bit of housekeeping. So I'll be doing a presentation, and then we have a Q&A discussion session. We'll ask you to post any questions via the Q&A function in Teams or via the chat, and we'll monitor both of those as we go through the session. We will come back to questions at the end because there's a bit for me to cover first. And you'll notice that everybody's muted and cameras are off. We decided to do that because there was quite a high number of people that were due to join this webinar. Currently, there's 117 people on it, which is fantastic. It's great engagement. But we can, if you raise your hand in the Q&A session, we can take you off mute and put you on camera so you can ask your questions or feed into the conversation. So what we'll cover today, I'll be going through our regulatory approach at a very high level. I'll be talking about why we've produced the information that we have, how that links in with our regulatory standards, and then kind of particularly what education providers need to do. From looking at the attendees list, I could see that there were attendees from that aren't necessarily at education providers, so I think we're welcoming professional body colleagues, colleagues from other regulators and other people too, but primarily I'll be directing this to education providers and what they need to do for that part of the session. I'll then just touch on our performance review process, and that will become clear. The reasons why will become clear as I go through the session, and then talk about our further developments in this area. And then there's the Q&A session and discussion session that I've already mentioned. So, education function of the HCPC, what do? We set and maintain education standards for the professions that we regulate. Those standards are output focused to ensure that those who complete programmes meet our requirements for registration. So those are our standards of proficiency and our standards of conduct, performance and ethics. Those are set at a threshold level to ensure safe and effective practice for the professions that we regulate. We then approve institutions and programmes against the education standards, and that's part of our statutory function as an organisation that's set in our legislation that we do that. We do that by making decisions about initial approval of education providers and programmes, and we also then monitor data, intelligence and information about those programmes and education providers on an ongoing basis. And education providers engage with us at fixed points to reflect on the ongoing quality of their provision through our performance review process, which I will come on to talk about in a little bit more detail. And crucially, on completion of an approved programme, an individual can apply to our register through our UK route, having satisfied that standards, our requirements for registration are met. So how do we do this? Our intention in the kind of blue box at the top there is that we are flexible, intelligent and data-led in our quality assurance of institutions and programmes. We have 4 key pillars to our regulatory model that enables us to do that. So we assess at the institution and the programme level, depending on the situation. And we try and focus our assessments at the institution level wherever possible, because there are many institutions or education providers that deliver lots of programmes, and we don't want to be asking you the same question lots and lots of times when we can ask it once. We're also flexible, so we consider what's happening and we consider potential problems before we jump to any solutions. As I've mentioned, we use data and intelligence through our decision making, and that's structured data and also intelligence from different stakeholders, such as professional bodies, organisations like the NHS England and NHS Education Scotland, and linking in with that, we have a 4 nations and regional approach, where members of my team are responsible for the nations and the regions in England, understand what's happening in those nations and regions, and can use that to contextualise our assessments and our regulatory activities. So why are we providing information about AI in education? So we do recognise that there are lots of challenges and opportunities presented by developments in AI and related technologies, and those link to the provision of education and training itself, and also emerging areas of practice. So we want to be proactive and clear about how these developments might link in with our regulatory standards and requirements, and apply the right level of regulatory oversight. As I've mentioned, we want to be flexible and make sure that we are applying a reasonable level of regulation in different situations. And this is a changing environment, and we recognise that, and so have wanted to design this guidance and information to be helpful to consider what the regulator needs in this situation. And I would just note, there's a note on artificial intelligence really that I'd like to make. Firstly, I think this is a bit of a catch-all term at the moment, and different people understand AI meaning different things. I think often we're talking about things like generative AI, so kind of chat bots and that kind of information, which are obviously very advanced now compared to where they were even just a few years ago. But also relevant to HCPC professions, there are things like diagnostic tools that are now being used in practice. And so we want to, it's just important that that term is understood as meaning kind of anything that might link in with those kinds of technologies and systems. I would also just note that I'm not sitting here pretending to be an expert in AI, and really nobody at the HCPC is. We have, though, and we are experts in our regulatory requirements and our standards, and we've made some judgments about where developments in AI technology would link in with our standards, which I'll just come on to in a moment. So our standards of education and training, there are some key links with developments of technology within our standards of education and training, and I'll just go through these in a little bit of detail now. So set 3.12 requires that the resources to support learning in all settings must be effective and appropriate to the delivery of the programme, and must be accessible to all learners and educators. Set 4.4 is about the curriculum remaining relevant to current practice. Set 6.3 is about assessments providing an objective, fair and reliable measure of learners' progression and achievement. And set 6.5 is the assessment methods used must be appropriate to and effective at measuring the learning outcomes. Now I'm going to come back to how those link in with some of the areas that we're asking you as education providers to consider when developing in AI. And our standards of proficiency. Through our standards of proficiency, there are requirements linked to this area for registrants. This is a non-exhaustive list, but there are a couple of key ones that I've just picked out here. So registrants need to keep their skills and knowledge up to date, and they also need to change their practices needed to take account of new developments, technologies, and changing contexts. And those are really important areas, as are all of the standards of proficiency, to deliver through HCPC-approved education and training programs. Now, clearly, the use of AI in practice is different for different professions, and as professional experts and those developing and running programs that lead to registration, you'll have a lot of influence and say on what emerging areas need to be considered as part of sort of standard threshold practice. We don't set through our standards things like a list of all technologies that an individual must be familiar with using. They are set at a higher level than that, and that's really because it would be impossible for us to keep an accurate list of things like technologies, and this applies to other areas of our standards too, things like lists of legislation that might be relevant to somebody's practice, and keep those or that list up to date, or those lists up to date on an ongoing basis. We review our standards. We start a review 5 years after the previous set of standards were first introduced. And they, as I say, they are set at a higher level, which don't kind of include those kinds of specifics. The standards of proficiency, though, do need to be delivered and assessed through HCPC approved programs, and there's a link in there with our education standards, sets 4.1 and 6.1. So in relation to AI in education, what we are asking education providers to do is to proactively consider this area, linking to continued adherence with those standards that were on a couple of slides back and the standards of proficiency. So particularly, we're asking you to consider how you continue to maintain academic integrity with increased accessibility of AI technology to learners. We're asking you to consider how you support your staff and your learners to become AI literate, including risks and benefits of AI in learning and in practice. We're asking you to consider how you cover emerging technology within practice as part of your program's curricula. So that may be specific things, and it may be more ways of thinking about how these kinds of technologies might be applied. It might be both. And we are also asking you to consider how biases can be mitigated through your developments. And there is increasing evidence of biases built into generative AI because they are reflective. And, so they're only ever as good as the source material. So there is increasing evidence that biases are built into AI. So we're asking you to consider how biases can be mitigated through developments to your programs. We are also suggesting here that this happens at an institution level. So many education providers in the room, many education providers that we approve programs at will have multiple HCPC approved programs. And we would suggest, instead of doing a piece of work on this multiple times, you consider a central way of working, or a central way of developing your thinking in this area. And then you can present that to the HCPC as one thing. And I'll talk about how you'll need to engage with HCPC on this slightly later. But we really do suggest that happens at the institution level. And we have key contacts at your institution. Your institution has defined those key contacts, and those are the people that we talk to primarily. We call them quality assurance contacts. We're quality assurance people, and we talk the same language as quality assurance people in your institutions. So we have really good, strong links in with those contacts. So we are asking you to consider this internally before coming to us, before talking to us, and trying to do that in a joined up way. So we will ask you to reflect on these questions through your next performance review assessment. Now, I will come on to just talk about our performance review process in a little bit more detail in a moment, but essentially that's a cyclical process where we will review the performance of your institution. We set the cycle length out of the last assessments that we undertook of your institution, and that can be between 1 and 5 years. So it'll be when you next engage. We do at the moment ask some related questions through performance review, and so those of you that are in performance review this year, you'll have seen those questions, or colleagues in your institution would have seen those questions in the portfolios that we supplied to you, but we will be asking some further questions linked to those 4 areas that that are on the top of this slide. So I want to be really clear here that we're not running any kind of extraordinary review on this topic. We don't feel that that's the best solution at this point. We don't think that we need education providers to be telling us exactly what's happening right now with what they're doing in AI. You are all, and I use this term deliberately, properly organised to deliver education and training. That's a term from our legislation, and we've made an explicit judgment that you're able to do that through previous assessments. So we don't need to review changes to your provision or sign off changes to your provision from a regulatory perspective. The vast majority of changes, except when things are really going wrong, or if there are big things happening like campus moves, we would ask to kind of talk to you in those situations. But for this kind of area, we are confident that you are, doing the thinking and are able to do the thinking to develop well in this area. And also, fundamentally and quite frankly, I noted that we're not experts in AI, and actually that it's such a movable feast at the moment that we are. We don't have a really good sense of what good looks like, of what normal looks like, which is why we're asking you to do the thinking and for you to come to your own solutions to mitigate these potential challenges and areas that are linked to our standards. So just be very clear, We are not running any kind of extraordinary review, and we're not going to be asking you to do anything outside of our normal monitoring activities. Our performance review process. Some of what I've just stated is on this slide as well, actually. So our approach to change is very important. Education providers are properly organised to deliver education and training. A really key underpinning part of how we quality assure is that we will review data and intelligence and informal engagement with education providers and others. So we have regular data supplies, and so when we make a judgment that an education provider doesn't need to engage for, say, 4 or 5 years, we will still monitor data and information in that period, and we'll still talk to the education provider, but just much less formally than requesting a kind of specific return to us from a monitoring perspective. Now, that 5-year period or 4-year period or 3-year period, it can move and it can shorten, those decisions we would make based on what we see through the data that we receive and any intelligence received, and we would take the decision about whether to do that in collaboration with you as the education provider. Performance review is intended to be a periodic and proportionate engagement with education providers to ensure the performance and quality of their provision. That aligns with our right touch regulatory principles. So that is considering risk, considering issues, and considering when it's best that we next engage with an education provider, depending on the specific situation, rather than applying a one-size-fits-all approach to our monitoring mechanisms. Clearly, we have limited resources, and we want to ensure that we are using them really effectively in the most significant situations, the one where we will add most value as a regulator, and the ones where we most need to intervene to protect the public, which is our overriding function. And through performance review, we ask you to reflect on 6 thematic areas. So it's a self-reflective exercise. So we do ask you some specific questions there, but we don't ask you to do things like directly map to our standards and tell us exactly how you're doing everything. We know all of that information because you've been through our approval process and you've been through previous monitoring. But we ask you to reflect on kind of key areas from an institution perspective. So that will be things like how your interprofessional education has functioned, what's happening in the EDI space, for example. Thematic reflection will include things like emerging technology. So we also have at the moment response to COVID in our portfolios there for education providers that haven't kind of talked to us about that already. But this is where we'll include information about AI. So there's kind of a specific part of the portfolio where we can ask questions that are kind of relevant, active questions for active current situations. We also ask you to reflect on how you've worked with other sector bodies. So that might be other regulators, it might be systems regulators or professional regulators, and what those areas have brought up in terms of developing your programme. We ask you to reflect from a profession-specific perspective, and that may be where things like development in AI technology could come in. So if you needed to make profession-specific changes to your curricula, for example, it may be that you can reflect on them through the profession-specific reflection part of the portfolio. And then we ask about your stakeholders and how they fed back. So that's learners, that's practice educators and others, and consider the actions that you've taken there. And lastly, we present the data that we have to you and we ask you to self-reflect on that. Or if we don't have relevant data points, there's an opportunity for you to establish data points and the supply of data points with the HCPC, which will enable a longer review period than sort of the 2 years, which is the ceiling if we don't have data about education providers. So the performance review process that's a really quick high-level overview, and we certainly will. When we invite you to respond through the performance review process, you'll get loads more information. I expect there are people on the call today who are going through that process at the moment and working with members of my team who are also in the room actually. But you will get much more information about how that all needs to function and what that looks and feels like when you're engaging with that process. And we write to education providers who will be involved in the next academic year. in the summer. So we normally go out in early July with our requirements for the performance review process for the next academic year. So development timeline. So now you all need to start considering this area if you haven't already. I've put there on the slide because I appreciate that some education providers, many education providers will already have been thinking about a lot of this. But if you haven't, now's the time to start, I would say. We are undertaking a review of our standards of education and training starting in this financial year. So that has just about kicked off. And this AI and similar technologies will be considered through our SETS review about whether we need to specifically reference this kind of technology through the review or whether kind of existing standards are able to cover what we need them to from an AI perspective and developments in technology. What we also plan to do, either from the 25-26 or 26-27 academic year, is analyze what's happened. So I mentioned that we're not experts in AI at the HCPC. We also don't know what normal looks like and what best practice always looks like, although there are some really brilliant resources out there which are referenced in the information that we've given to you. We want to be very clear, I suppose, that we're not experts, but we do have that consideration about linking in with our standards. But the thing we will be able to do once we start to receive information about how education providers have responded to this, we will be able to start picking through themes and considering and presenting back to the sector what's normal, what the challenges have been, what kind of opportunities there have been, and how education providers have dealt with this kind of challenge and opportunity. So we'll be able to reflect that back to the sector either from 25-26 or 26-27, really depending on what we see through portfolios where education providers come back to us on. And then TBC at the moment, because we don't know the scope of the SETS review at the moment, depending on the significance of change, we will be putting revised standards of education and training in place, which may, as I was saying, include some more specific information about AI in education. So sources of information, so these are linked to, and you'll be able to access these when we send you across the slides after today. We'll publish the recording, like I was saying, and the slides, and produce some FAQs too. And I had another point on that. Oh yeah, so within the AI in education guidance, firstly, I hope this session has been useful for colleagues to kind of link in with what our regulatory requirements are. Within that information, there are links to other organizations who have done lots of work on this area. So there is kind of, lots of thinking out there already and lots of considerations that you may need to kind of consider yourself or make, and lots of examples of good and best practice out there too. And so we've tried to link to those, recognizing that we are not experts at HCPC, but there are lots of experts out there, and certainly those organizations can help. So there's some great information from the QAA, for example. I know professional bodies are having kind of similar thoughts at the moment to HCPC and how they can help facilitate kind of good and best practice too. So thanks very much, everybody, for your engagement. So there's a list here of all of the different people in my team. So please get in touch with individuals that are your kind of national or regional leads. Like I say, that we ask that you liaise internally with your nominated HCPC quality assurance contact, because those are the people that we have kind of primary relationships with at education providers, and then that person can liaise as on behalf of your institution. We really do feel that this is an area that's best kind of considered centrally, and then you can present kind of one view to the HCPC, which may have some professional differences, but kind of one view to the HCPCs on things like academic integrity and supporting staff and learners as well. So there's a list of people there, and you'll get that with the slide deck too. So just a big thanks for everybody to coming today. Been a really well attended session, and I hope that's useful for colleagues. And I think that the crucial thing for me is that we need to keep having this conversation. So the conversation isn't over, and like I said, there's more development to come on the way really here. So thanks. I can see lots of thumbs up and claps. So thank you very much for your engagement today. All right, thank you everyone. I'll close the meeting off now.